Unacademy. This is Astha Outdoor Educator, and I'm currently pursuing my post-graduation in English Literature from Bhubaneswar. Well, we are doing an entirely new course, as I have told. I hope you like the first lesson on tradition and experiments and developments in poetry. So this is the second lesson that we are doing. I hope you like it also. It's on Chaucer and Spenser tradition. So do not forget to follow me on Unacademy. Thanks a lot.
The history of English language has been conveniently divided into three periods or stages, I would say. The first period is called the Anglo-Saxon or Old English period and extends roughly from the 7th century to the 11th century. The second stage is known as the Middle English and it comes down to the middle of 15th century. From that point onwards, we have modern or New English. We should probe into the tradition and their developments in English poetry. So here we are. We'll be studying about the Chaucerian tradition and its development first. Chaucer wrote at the end of the Middle English period, which was really a stage of transition between Old English and New English. He may be said, therefore, to have commenced the modern period of English literature. Chaucer was essentially a traditionalist. In his days, there were 4 well-marked dialects. It is lucky that Chaucer spoke and wrote the dialect which the geographical and political reasons was bound to become the literary language of England, namely the East Midland as spoken in London. But Chaucer was at that time an experimentalist. He developed the tradition and gave a new life to the English poetry. Keeping in view Chaucer's tradition and development in English poetry, he stands high among English writers. He introduced the heroic couplet into English verse, and he handled decasyllabic line with a mastery which was the envy and despair of the following century. The loss of the final sounded E from the language misled English readers for more than 300 years into supposing that Chaucer was a rudimentarist. But the discovery that final syllables are sounded according to strict rules of grammar, and Scansion revealed him as one of the masters of English verse. Moreover, he infused suppleness and smoothness in English language. His language is superbly colloquial, witty, musical, and sparkling. The period in which Chaucer lived was one of the great literary activity, and such names as Richard Rolle of Hampole, Minot, Middleville, and others prove that the English language was in a healthy and vigorous condition, and really deserving the importance into which it was rising. But as yet there was no such national language, and consequently no national literature. The English of 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries diverged into many dialects, each having its own literary intelligible only of a comparatively small circle of readers, and no one form of English can be considered as the type of language of the period. Of these dialects, the East Midland that was spoken with some variations was perhaps the simplest in its grammatical structure and most free from those broad provincialisms which characterized the speech of other districts and presented the nearest approach in form and substance of the language. Chaucer represented and identified himself with that a new life with the English people at that time were just commencing, and his works reflect not only his own inimitable genius but the spirit, tastes, and feelings of his age. It was this, combined with his thorough mastery over the English language, that made Chaucer a standard of literary excellence, and for more than 200 years after, he had no equal and was regarded as the father of English poetry. So now there were three principal meters to be found in Chaucer's verse. In the Canterbury Tales, he uses lines of 10 syllables and 5 accents each, and the lines run into couplets. Well, the same musical measure, arranged in 7-line stanzas, but with a different rhyme, called rhyme royal, was found in its most perfect way in his work called Troilus. And the third meter is that the 8-syllable line with 4 accents and lines rhyming in couplets, as was found in one of his works, the Book to the Duchess. Beside these principal meters, Chaucer, in his short poems, also used many other poetic forms modeled after the French. In his work, The Mock's Tale, there is a melodious measure which may have furnished the model of Spenser's famous stanza. Chaucer's poetry is extremely musical and must be judged by the ear rather than the eye. To the modern reader, the lines might appear broken and uneven, but if one reads them over a few times, he will soon catch the perfect swing of the measure, and he'll also find that the hands of the master, whose ear is delicately sensitive to the smallest accent. There is the lilt in all his lines, which is marvelous when we consider that he is the first to show us the poetic possibilities of the language. His claim upon our gratitude is twofold. First, for discovering the music that is in our English speech, and the second one is for his influence in fixing the Midland dialect as the literary language of England. Well, after studying about the brief tradition and experiments in poetry of Chaucer, we can come to the Spenserian tradition and its developments now. Well, looking back on the poetry of the 16th century with the historian's perspective, we can see clearly enough that the endeavor to establish English as a poetic language, at least the equal of Italian and French, promoted, or whatever they prompted, much of the experimentation and exercising that went on in Tudor verse. Spenser is the founder of poetic diction, which he himself deliberately invented. It is not the natural poetic diction because he deliberately made it archaic. He, in affecting the ancient, write no language, says Ben Jonson, or in other words, his dialect is not the dialect of any actual place or time, but it is an artificial poetic diction made up by Chaucer, which consists of archaic words, foreign words, and other different dialects. Thus, it is an invented language which could not be read easily by his contemporaries. It is standard English in his days. So it was essential for him to invent poetic diction of his own. It may have provided him with abundance of melodious words, with many new rhythms for his different stanzas, which were very difficult. It also introduced a special flavor for chivalry and the customs of chivalry. Really, his language suggested the distinctive tone and temper of such works. His peculiar language would be more suggestive for the men of Spenser's day, could easily step in the romances of chivalry rather than for the present generation. Well, Spenser made the first experiment with the language in Shepherd's Calendar. In an introductory episode, he remarks, "In my opinion, it is one special praise of many which are due to this poet, that hath laboured to restore, as to the rightful heritage, such good and natural English words as have been long time out of use and almost clean disherited. Well, I took a lot of time to read this because it was written in an archaic language. So after all the research, this was divided into some usual words, which was divided into 5 classes actually. So these were the words, those were derived from Middle English literature, from dialects, Elizabethan colloquialism, literary and learned words, coinages of Spenser's own words. So the words borrowed from earlier authors are often incorrectly used. In spite of all these, the experiments were necessary and useful. So it's rightly said that Spenser's greatest contribution to the art of English versification was what was subsequently called the Spenserian stanza. Some critics are of opinion that he deprived it from the ottava rima, so universally employed by the romantic and narrative poets of Italy, and made familiar by the masterpieces of Tasso and Aristo. But let me tell you, Spenser's stanzas were quite different. It was his own inventions, and the Spenserian stanza consisted of decasyllabic iambic lines rhyming as AB, AB, BC, BC, and C, followed by an Alexandrian rhyming C. The limitations of the rhyme to 3 and the length of the stanza and the slight swell, sometimes rising, sometimes dying, of the Alexandrine combine to give the stanza a melody, dignity, and a scope for rich description. Thus, the stanza is very useful because its scope is vast and can be successfully used for various purposes. It is helpful for description, reflection, narrative, and argument. Meanwhile, it also moves steadily and with immense and intense strength. So thus Spenser's tradition and its developments and his contributions were never common. They were completely different, yet a little difficult. So thus we're done with the lesson here. I hope you liked it. Chaucer and Spenser are really important in our English literature, and every student must know about them. So these were the tradition and experiment in poetry that they have done. So I hope you liked the lesson. Do not forget to follow me on Unacademy. I'll be coming up with more interesting lessons as well. Thank you.